While 3 men fought to stay alive in space, a speechwriter on Earth was already writing their eulogy. The president would call the widows first. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970, at 1:13 p.m. Eastern Time. It was another moonshot, the third in less than a year. In the control room, the mood was almost routine. Jim Lovell, John Swigert, and Fred Haise were already familiar names to the small circle that followed every mission. But to most Americans, they were just the latest crew. By then, the country had seen men walk on the moon, and the networks treated this flight like background noise. The astronauts drifted through space, 200,000 miles out, so far that a radio signal took more than a second to reach them, and their voices barely registered back home. The launch drew a 12% share on Nielsen, down from 31% for Apollo 11. Newspapers buried the mission on inside pages. For most people, the moon had become a place you could visit and return from, as ordinary as a business trip. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise floated in the command module Odyssey, heading for a landing that nobody planned to watch. The world had already written off the danger. That is how the story began. With a mission so quiet, it was almost forgotten, until the silence broke. April 13th, 1970. The clock read just past 55 hours into the flight. Out in the void, Apollo 13 drifted nearly 200,000 miles from Earth, so far that a radio call took over a second to cross the silence. Inside Odyssey, the crew ran through a checklist so routine it barely registered. Jack Swigert flipped the switch to stir the oxygen tanks. The command was standard, a maintenance chore to keep the supercooled oxygen from stratifying. Then, in less than a heartbeat, everything changed. A dull bang rattled the spacecraft. Warning lights snapped on. The cabin lights flickered and died. The panel readouts for oxygen pressure plunged. In that moment, Swigert's voice cut through the static. "Houston, we've had a problem." 4 seconds later, Jim Lovell repeated it, his tone steady but tight. The words were calm, but what was happening was anything but. Oxygen tank 2 had exploded, tearing open the side of the service module. The blast crippled tank 1 as well. Both tanks fed the fuel cells that powered Odyssey. Now those cells were failing, starved of oxygen, dying by the minute. Outside, a thin white plume twisted away from the ship. That was precious oxygen venting straight into space, hundreds of pounds of life support gone in seconds. The command module's power dropped off a cliff. Lights, fans, navigation, and the environmental system all began to shut down. The temperature started to fall. The air was thinning. The crew wasn't just stranded, they were losing the very things that kept them alive. No one in mission control had seen numbers like these. In less than a minute, a flight that had been written off as routine became a fight against suffocating, freezing, and dying in the dark. The world heard the radio call, but NASA did not say this on the broadcast. The odds were grim, and the crew was already being doubted back on Earth. 3 men squeezed into a cabin built for 2. The lunar module Aquarius was never meant to be a lifeboat, but now it was all that stood between Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise, and the void. Aquarius had enough air, power, and water for 2 men for about 2 days. It now had to keep 3 men alive for close to 4. Every system was stretched. Every calculation was a guess. Inside, the air grew thick with carbon dioxide, the invisible poison of their own breath. The scrubbers in Aquarius were round, but the only backup filters came from Odyssey, and those were square. The numbers on the carbon dioxide gauge kept climbing, ticking toward levels that would suffocate the crew before the world ever heard the real odds. Mission Control scrambled for a fix. The engineers on the ground, some just out of college, worked through the night. They came up with a plan that sounded like a joke. Build an adapter out of a plastic bag, a flight manual cover, a sock, and duct tape. The instructions were read up from Houston. The crew followed them, step by step, hands shaking from cold and hunger. When the makeshift filter finally worked, the carbon dioxide readings dropped. It bought them time, maybe 12 hours, maybe more. But the air inside Aquarius was still thin, and the cold was creeping in. The cabin temperature fell to about 3 degrees Celsius, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That is cold enough for your breath to fog and freeze on the walls. Condensation gathered in beads, then turned to frost. The men shivered in their suits, sleeping in shifts, rationing water down to 6 ounces a day, less than a cup. Fred Haise got sick. The records show a urinary tract infection, likely from dehydration. By the third day, the crew had lost about 4 pounds each. Joints ached, fingers numbed, and the lunar module felt less like a spacecraft than a tomb in orbit. The world watched a rescue, but inside Aquarius, the odds were grim. NASA did not say this on the broadcast. The men were suffocating, freezing, and being slowly written off as presumed dead. Inside Mission Control, the calculations were written in pencil, but the odds felt carved in stone. The numbers pointed one way. 3 men, 200,000 miles from Earth, rationed to less than a cup of water a day, trapped in a freezing cabin that was never meant to be a lifeboat. Behind the headsets and steady voices, some of the people closest to the math doubted Lovell, Swigert, and Haise would make it home alive. Flight directors like Gene Kranz and Glenn Lunny later admitted they were already counting the dead, with survival odds privately estimated at less than 30%. The public heard only calm updates and talk of ingenuity. But inside the White House, contingency plans were drafted by men who had seen the Saphir in event of moon disaster memo for Apollo 11. That speech, never used, spoke of commending souls to the deep, a burial at sea for men stranded beyond rescue. For Apollo 13, the framework was less polished, but just as grim. The president would call the widows before facing the cameras. A clergyman would stand by to recite the same burial at sea language, commending the astronauts' souls to the deep. Frank Borman, NASA's liaison, prepared a phone script and eulogy draft. The families would be notified before the world knew. None of this reached the crew. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise drifted through the dark, fighting for each breath, while on Earth, they were already being buried in memos and condolence scripts. NASA did not say this on the broadcast. The odds were grim, and the men inside Aquarius were presumed dead long before splashdown. There was only one way home, a narrow corridor through space, barely wide enough for a bullet. Apollo 13's free return path would loop them around the far side of the moon and sling them back toward Earth, but the explosion had knocked them off course. Without the command module's guidance computer, Lovell, Swigert, and Haise were forced to steer by hand, staring through a frosted window at the sun and the razor edge where daylight ends on Earth. The lunar module's crosshair sight became their only compass. The PC+2 burn, a 20-second engine firing, had to be timed and aimed with no computer, just gut and grit. They were freezing, shivering, running on almost no sleep, but every correction mattered. One mistake and they'd miss the atmosphere, skipping off into the dark or hit too steep and burn. NASA did not say this on the broadcast. 3 men, exhausted and rationed, gambling everything on a manual burn. Re-entry was always the last gamble. Apollo 13 hit the upper atmosphere at 24,700 miles per hour. That was fast enough to cross the United States in 6 minutes. That speed turned air into plasma, a sheath of fire that cut off all radio contact. The blackout was supposed to last 3.5 minutes. On the ground, flight controllers watched the clock. 4 minutes passed. Still nothing. 4 minutes, 32 seconds. The silence stretched. People in mission control stared at their consoles, counting every second. In that window, nobody knew if the heat shield, scarred by the explosion, was holding or failing. No data, no voice, not even static. Just the possibility that the command module was burning up, and 3 men were dying in the dark. At 4 minutes, 32 seconds, a burst of static broke through. Jack Swigert's voice sounded thin, but alive. The world exhaled. Odyssey splashed down in the Pacific on April 17, 1970, after nearly 6 days stranded in space. Recovery ships pulled the crew from the capsule. They had lost weight, suffered dehydration, and come back with frostbitten fingers, but they were breathing. Jim Lovell lived for another 55 years, dying in August 2025 at age 97. Jack Swigert died of cancer in 1982, and Fred Haise lived into his 90s. The paperwork had been ready: condolence scripts, eulogy drafts, burial at sea language. The men survived anyway. NASA did not say this on the broadcast. They were already being buried, but they came home. Not every rescue is the story you are told.